In the perfectly manicured gardens of Chelsea, where every petal is positioned with precision and every leaf inspected for royal approval, the most unexpected moments often bloom in the most ordinary conversations. What happens when Britain's most beloved baking queen meets the Duke known for his razor-sharp wit and unfiltered observations? Sometimes, the most memorable royal moments aren't scripted ceremonies or grand speeches, but spontaneous exchanges that reveal the genuine human nature behind the crowns and titles. On a particularly bright May morning at the world's most prestigious flower show, two British icons were about to create a moment that would be talked about in royal circles and kitchen conversations across the nation for years to come. It was a meeting of two worlds, the formal grandeur of the royal family and the warm, flower-dusted charm of Britain's favorite baker. Neither Prince Philip nor Mary Berry knew they were about to become part of a story that would perfectly capture the essence of British humor and the unexpected humanity that can emerge from the most formal occasions. The Chelsea Flower Show has always been a place where nature's beauty meets human creativity. But on this particular day, it would also become the setting for a conversation that would remind everyone that even royalty can find joy in the simplest, most unexpected moments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of the Royal Hospital Chelsea as the final preparations for the Chelsea Flower Show reached their crescendo. It was May 2019, and the anticipation in the air was almost as fragrant as the thousands of blooms that had been carefully arranged across the venue. This wasn't just any flower show. It was the event that marked the beginning of the British summer social calendar, where horticultural excellence met royal tradition in a celebration that had been running for over a century. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, had been a regular visitor to the Chelsea Flower Show for decades. Even at 97 years old, his passion for gardens and environmental conservation remained as strong as ever. Despite his advancing age and recent retirement from official royal duties, he had specifically requested to attend this year's show. The palace staff had been initially hesitant, concerned about the extensive walking required and the crowds of people, but the Duke had been characteristically firm in his decision. "I've been coming to this show longer than most of these exhibitors have been alive," he had told his private secretary with his typical directness. "I'm not about to stop now, because my knees creak a bit more than they used to." The Duke's love affair with gardens had begun in his childhood and had only deepened through his marriage to Queen Elizabeth II. Over the years, he had become genuinely knowledgeable about horticulture, often surprising garden designers and botanists with his insightful questions and observations. He particularly enjoyed the innovation displays, where new techniques and sustainable gardening practices were showcased. His environmental awareness, which had been ahead of its time when he began speaking about conservation in the 1960s, made him a keen observer of how the gardening world was adapting to climate change challenges. On this particular morning, as his car pulled through the gates of the Royal Hospital, Prince Philip felt a familiar excitement. The press day for the Chelsea Flower Show was always one of his favorite events. Unlike the public days that would follow, the press day offered a chance to really examine the gardens without the crowds, to have meaningful conversations with the designers, and to appreciate the incredible artistry and hard work that went into each display. The morning air was crisp and perfect for walking through gardens. The Duke had specifically chosen to wear his most comfortable shoes and had brought along his walking stick, though he hoped he wouldn't need to rely on it too heavily. His equerry walked discreetly behind him, ready to assist if needed, but Prince Philip had made it clear that he wanted to enjoy the morning at his own pace. As they approached the main entrance, the familiar sounds of the flower show enveloped them. There was the gentle hum of conversation, mixed with the clicking of camera shutters, the distant sound of water features, and the occasional burst of laughter from groups of visitors discovering something particularly impressive. The Duke paused for a moment, breathing in the complex perfume of thousands of different flowers blooming together in the confined space. "Magnificent as always," he murmured to himself, straightening his shoulders and preparing to embark on what had become an annual pilgrimage. The first garden they visited was a contemporary design focusing on sustainable urban living. The designer, a young woman from Manchester, was nervously explaining her concept when Prince Philip approached. She had clearly been briefed about royal protocol, but her passion for her work quickly overcame her nerves as she began describing how every element of the garden could be replicated in small city spaces. Fascinating, Prince Philip said, genuinely interested in her composting system. And you're saying this works, even in Manchester weather? His question brought a laugh from the designer, who had been worried about whether her northern sensibilities would translate to a London audience. Especially in Manchester weather, Your Royal Highness, she replied with growing confidence. If it can survive there, it can survive anywhere. Prince Philip chuckled appreciatively. He had always enjoyed conversations with people who were passionate about their work, regardless of their background or status. Throughout his long life of official engagements, he had developed a genuine talent for putting people at ease while learning something new himself. They moved on to examine a garden dedicated to mental health and well-being, where the designer had carefully chosen plants known for their therapeutic properties. The Duke spent considerable time here, asking detailed questions about the research behind the plant choices and the intended effect on visitors' mood and stress levels. His interest was clearly more than polite. He seemed genuinely curious about the intersection between gardening and health. As the morning progressed, Prince Philip's energy seemed to be holding up well. He had been walking for over an hour, but his step remained relatively steady, and his questions continued to be sharp and insightful. The press photographers followed at a respectful distance, occasionally snapping pictures when he was engaged in particularly animated conversation with a garden designer. It was approaching mid-morning when they reached the section of the showgrounds where the hospitality marquees were located. These large white tents housed everything from corporate entertainment spaces to media interview areas. The BBC had set up a significant presence here, broadcasting live throughout the day and conducting interviews with notable visitors and garden designers. Prince Philip had been scheduled for a brief rest stop in one of the smaller marquees, where he could sit down with a cup of tea and review the remaining gardens on his itinerary. However, as they approached the hospitality area, his attention was caught by a small crowd gathered around one of the BBC interview stations. The familiar voice that drifted across the space was warm and unmistakably comforting, with the kind of gentle authority that had made its owner a beloved figure in British homes for decades. Mary Berry was in the middle of an interview about her new gardening project, discussing how her love for growing her own vegetables had inspired her latest cookbook. Prince Philip slowed his pace, listening with interest to the conversation. Mary Berry had been a fixture in British culture for so long that even he, with his sometimes limited exposure to popular television, was well aware of who she was and her significance in the national consciousness. More importantly, he had heard that she was a genuinely knowledgeable gardener in her own right, not just someone who had taken up the hobby for publicity purposes. "Shall we continue, sir?" his equerry asked quietly, aware that they were slightly behind schedule. Prince Philip paused, considering. His official program called for the tea break, followed by visits to 3 more major garden displays. However, something about overhearing Mary Berry's enthusiastic discussion about companion planting and organic growing methods had sparked his curiosity. "Actually," he said with a slight smile that his staff had learned to recognize as the prelude to an impromptu change of plans, "I think I'd quite like to hear what Mrs. Berry has to say about vegetables. From what I can hear, she knows what she's talking about." Without waiting for a response, Prince Philip adjusted his course and began walking toward the BBC interview area. His equerry hurried to catch up, mentally revising the morning schedule and hoping that this spontaneous detour wouldn't cause too much disruption to the carefully planned itinerary. As they approached the interview station, Mary Berry was just finishing her conversation with the BBC presenter. She was explaining her philosophy about the connection between good soil and good food, her hands moving expressively as she spoke about the satisfaction of cooking with vegetables you had grown yourself. "There's something almost magical about picking a tomato that's still warm from the sun and using it in your cooking that same day," she was saying. "You can taste the difference, and somehow the whole meal means more because you've been part of the entire process from seed to plate." Prince Philip found himself nodding in agreement. As someone who had been involved in the management of the royal estates and their gardens for decades, he understood exactly what she meant. The satisfaction of eating produce from your own garden was something that transcended social boundaries. The interview concluded, and Mary Berry stood up from her chair, smoothing her signature floral dress and preparing to move on to her next appointment. She was scheduled to visit several of the artisan food stalls and then tour the main show gardens. Gathering material for a special feature, she was preparing about the connection between gardening and cooking. It was at this moment, as Mary Berry turned to thank the BBC crew and Prince Philip continued his approach toward the interview area, that the stage was set for an encounter that neither of them expected, but both would remember fondly for years to come. Mary Berry had just stepped away from the BBC interview station when she noticed a small commotion nearby. There was something about the way people were subtly adjusting their positions and the appearance of what looked like security personnel that immediately suggested the presence of someone important. Having spent decades in the public eye herself, she had developed an instinct for recognizing when royalty was in the vicinity. She turned slightly and saw Prince Philip approaching, walking with the careful but determined gait of someone who refused to let age dictate his pace entirely. Even at 97, he maintained an unmistakable bearing that spoke of a lifetime of naval service and royal duty. His famous white hair was perfectly groomed despite the morning breeze, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him such an effective royal consort for over 70 years. Mary felt the familiar flutter of nerves that came with unexpected encounters with members of the royal family. Despite her own considerable fame and the fact that she had been awarded an MBE and later made a CBE for her services to culinary arts, meeting royalty always brought back the properly brought-up girl from Bath who had learned the importance of respect and protocol. She had actually met Prince Philip briefly on a few previous occasions at various official functions, but never in such an informal setting as this. Usually, their encounters had been in receiving lines or during formal presentations, where conversation was limited to pleasantries and carefully scripted exchanges. This felt different somehow, more spontaneous and relaxed. Prince Philip, for his part, had noticed Mary Berry finishing her interview and recognized her immediately. Over the years, he had heard numerous positive things about her from various sources. The Queen herself had mentioned Mary's work with charitable organizations, particularly her involvement with Child Bereavement UK, which had impressed the royal family with its important work supporting families dealing with loss. Moreover, Prince Philip had overheard enough of Mary's interview to be genuinely interested in her thoughts about gardening and sustainable food production. As someone who had been advocating for environmental conservation and sustainable practices since long before it became fashionable, he appreciated meeting others who understood the importance of these issues. "Mrs. Berry," Prince Philip said as he approached, his voice carrying the authority and slight accent that had become familiar to millions through decades of public appearances. "I couldn't help but overhear some of your interview. You were speaking very sensibly about vegetable gardening." Mary immediately straightened and offered a respectful curtsy, not too deep, but appropriate for the informal setting. "Your Royal Highness, how lovely to see you. I do hope you're enjoying the show this morning." "Indeed I am," Prince Philip replied, his eyes showing a hint of amusement. "Though I have to say, hearing someone talk about companion planting and soil health with such obvious knowledge rather than just for the cameras is refreshing. Tell me, do you really do your own gardening, or is that just for the television people?" The question was asked with Prince Philip's characteristic directness, but Mary could hear the genuine curiosity behind it. She had been asked similar questions many times over the years, as people sometimes assumed that television personalities had teams of helpers doing the actual work while they simply presented the results. "Oh, I absolutely do my own gardening, sir," Mary replied with a smile that lit up her entire face. "I'm out in the vegetable patch most mornings when I'm at home. There's something wonderfully therapeutic about having your hands in the soil, and I find I do my best thinking while I'm weeding or watering." Prince Philip nodded approvingly. Quite right. I've always found that myself. Some of my best ideas have come to me while working in the gardens at Sandringham. There's something about the rhythm of garden work that clears the mind wonderfully. The conversation was developing a natural flow that surprised both participants. Usually, meetings between royalty and celebrities, even at informal events like the Chelsea Flower Show, followed certain predictable patterns. There would be polite inquiries about the event, perhaps a comment about the weather, and then a gracious conclusion that allowed both parties to move on to their next obligations. However, this exchange felt different from the start. Both Prince Philip and Mary Berry were discovering that they shared not just an interest in gardening, but a similar practical, down-to-earth approach to it. Neither was interested in gardens purely as decoration or status symbols. They both appreciated the satisfaction of growing things successfully and understanding the science behind why plants thrive. I particularly enjoyed what you were saying about growing your own tomatoes, Prince Philip continued. We've been experimenting with heritage varieties at Highgrove and Sandringham. Some of the flavors you can achieve with the older cultivars are remarkable. Much better than anything you can buy in the shops, even the expensive ones. Mary's face brightened even more. Oh, you're absolutely right. I grow several heritage varieties myself. The Brandywine tomatoes are particularly wonderful, though they can be a bit temperamental. And the Cherokee purples have such an unusual color, but the most incredible taste. Ah, yes, the Cherokee purple, Prince Philip said, his interest clearly genuine. We tried those a few years ago. Fascinating variety. Bit ugly to look at, but the flavor more than makes up for it. Though I have to say, getting the watering right was a bit of a challenge. Oh, that's the secret with heritage tomatoes, Mary replied enthusiastically, temporarily forgetting the formal nature of their conversation in her excitement about sharing gardening knowledge. They really don't like inconsistent watering. I found that a good thick mulch helps enormously with moisture retention, and I always water in the morning rather than the evening. Prince Philip was clearly enjoying this exchange of practical gardening advice. It was exactly the sort of conversation he loved most, knowledgeable, practical, and free from a sort of superficial small talk that dominated so many of his official interactions. Here was someone who obviously knew what she was talking about, and wasn't afraid to share detailed information. Mulching, yes, he said thoughtfully. We use a lot of well-rotted manure mixed with straw. Seems to work well, though I suspect your garden might be a bit more manageable than ours. How large is your vegetable garden? Oh, it's nothing too ambitious, Mary replied modestly. Just a few raised beds behind the house. Enough to keep me in fresh herbs and vegetables for cooking, with a bit extra to share with neighbors. I find that if you try to grow too much, you end up overwhelmed during harvest time. Very sensible approach, Prince Philip agreed. Though I have to admit, we sometimes get a bit carried away with the planting and end up with more courgettes than we know what to do with. Amazing how prolific they can be once they get going. Mary laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to put everyone around them at ease. Oh, don't talk to me about courgettes. I think every gardener in Britain has experienced the courgette crisis at least once. You plant 2 plants thinking there'll be plenty, and then suddenly you're desperately trying to give them away to anyone who'll take them. Exactly, Prince Philip said, and for a moment his usually formal demeanor gave way to something much more relaxed and natural. We've resorted to leaving bags of them by the back door with please take signs. Even the staff start avoiding certain corridors during courgette season. The image of Prince Philip sneaking around with surplus courgettes struck Mary as wonderfully funny, and she found herself genuinely laughing rather than offering the polite chuckles that such conversations usually required. There was something delightfully ordinary about discovering that even royal gardens suffered from the same abundance of enthusiasm over practicality that plagued gardeners everywhere. Meanwhile, both the Duke's equerry and Mary's assistant were beginning to look slightly anxious about the time. Both Prince Philip and Mary had other commitments that morning, and their spontaneous garden conversation was already running longer than anyone had anticipated. However, neither principal seemed particularly concerned about their schedules at the moment. The BBC crew that had been packing up their equipment after Mary's interview had noticed the royal presence and were now discreetly repositioning themselves to capture what was clearly developing into an unexpectedly extended conversation. The photographers were being careful not to intrude, but they recognized that this kind of natural, unscripted interaction between two beloved public figures was exactly the sort of moment that would resonate with the public. "I don't suppose," Prince Philip said thoughtfully, "that you've ever tried your hand at fruit trees? We've been having some interesting results with apples lately, and I'm curious about your thoughts on cooking varieties versus eating varieties." Mary's eyes lit up again. "Oh, I do love a good cooking apple. I grow a Bramley seedling that produces the most wonderful fruit for pies and crumbles. Though I have to admit, I've been tempted to try some of the newer disease-resistant varieties. The traditional ones can be quite susceptible to problems." Disease resistance is becoming increasingly important. Prince Philip agreed seriously. Climate change is bringing new challenges that our grandparent varieties weren't designed to handle. We're working with some agricultural colleges on developing sustainable approaches to orchard management. It was at this point that both realized they had been standing in the middle of the Chelsea Flower Show, discussing gardening with the intensity of two professionals comparing notes, completely absorbed in their shared enthusiasm for growing things successfully. As their conversation about fruit trees and sustainable gardening continued, Prince Philip noticed that a small crowd was beginning to gather at a respectful distance. Word had clearly spread that the Duke was having an extended conversation with Mary Berry, and people were curious to witness this unexpected pairing. However, both participants were so engrossed in their discussion that they seemed oblivious to the growing audience. "You know," Prince Philip said, glancing around and suddenly becoming aware of their surroundings again, "perhaps we should take a look at some of these gardens while we talk. I believe there's supposed to be an excellent kitchen garden display somewhere nearby." "That sounds wonderful," Mary agreed, also noticing the attention they were attracting. "I was particularly hoping to see the one with the heritage vegetables. I heard they have some varieties I've never encountered before." They began walking together toward the main show gardens, with Prince Philip's equerry and Mary's assistant trailing behind, both looking relieved that their principals were finally moving according to something resembling a schedule, even if it wasn't the original one. As they walked, their conversation continued to flow naturally. Prince Philip asked about Mary's approach to preserving and storing garden produce, while Mary was curious about the scale of food production at the royal estates and how they managed to coordinate gardening with the demands of official entertaining. "I imagine you must have to plan your garden harvests around state dinners and official functions," Mary observed as they paused to examine a display of climbing roses. "You'd be surprised how often we don't," Prince Philip replied with a slight grimace. "The kitchen staff are remarkably adaptable, but there have been occasions when we've had to explain to foreign dignitaries that the reason their salad contains so many radishes is because that's what happened to be ready in the garden that particular week." Mary chuckled at this image. "I can imagine that leads to some interesting menu planning challenges." "Oh, you have no idea," Prince Philip continued, warming to his theme. "There was one memorable dinner where we had an abundance of beetroot from the garden, and the kitchen decided to incorporate it into multiple courses. By the end of the evening, half the guests looked like they'd been dining exclusively on ruby-colored food. The French ambassador was particularly puzzled by the purple soup." "Purple soup," Mary repeated, clearly delighted by this story. "Beetroot and apple apparently," Prince Philip explained. "Sounded reasonable in theory, but the presentation was rather dramatic. The Queen spent the entire evening trying not to catch my eye across the table because she knew she'd start laughing if she did." Mary was thoroughly enjoying these glimpses into the more human side of royal entertaining. Like most people, she had always assumed that everything at royal functions was planned with military precision and executed flawlessly. The idea that they occasionally had to work around garden abundance like any other household was both surprising and oddly comforting. They had reached the heritage vegetable garden display, which was indeed impressive. The designers had created a beautiful combination of practical growing spaces and ornamental plantings, showing how productive gardens could also be visually appealing. Both Prince Philip and Mary were immediately drawn to examine the plant labels and growing techniques being demonstrated. "Oh, look at this," Mary said excitedly, pointing to a section growing various types of kale. "I've never seen some of these varieties before. Dobbinton's kale. I wonder how that differs from the usual curly kale in cooking." Prince Philip leaned in to read the information placard. "Says here it's a perennial variety that doesn't flower, so you can harvest from it for several years. Fascinating. Might be worth trying at Sandringham." As they continued examining the display, a garden photographer approached nervously, camera in hand. "Excuse me, Your Royal Highness, Mrs. Barry," he said politely. "Would you mind if I took a photograph of you both looking at the gardens? For the Horticultural Society magazine." Prince Philip and Mary glanced at each other, both recognizing that this was exactly the sort of request that occurred regularly at public events. They positioned themselves beside a particularly attractive display of climbing beans and smiled appropriately while the photographer took several shots. "Thank you very much," the photographer said gratefully, but as he was preparing to leave, Prince Philip held up a hand. "Just a moment," the Duke said, a mischievous glint in his eye that his family and staff would have recognized as the precursor to one of his famous spontaneous remarks. "Mrs. Barry, I just realized something rather amusing." "Oh," Mary replied, curious about what had caught his attention. "Well," Prince Philip continued, clearly building up to something, "here we are, both of us supposedly sophisticated adults, having spent the better part of an hour discussing the intimate details of courgette cultivation and beetroot disasters. I suddenly had the thought that if someone had told me 50 years ago that one of the highlights of my morning at the Chelsea Flower Show would be comparing notes on heritage tomatoes with Britain's most famous baker, I'd have thought they'd lost their mind." Mary began to smile, sensing that Prince Philip was working towards something entertaining. "But what's really amusing," he continued, his voice taking on the slightly theatrical tone that appeared when he was particularly enjoying himself, "is that I've just realized we've been standing here talking about vegetables with such seriousness that we could be mistaken for two people planning to revolutionize British agriculture. Meanwhile, I suspect most people would expect our conversation to be about cakes and state dinners, not the proper spacing for Brussels sprouts." "You're absolutely right," Mary laughed. "Though I have to say, I think vegetables are vastly underrated compared to cakes. You can't live on Victoria's sponge alone, no matter how perfectly it's made." "Quite right," Prince Philip agreed solemnly, "though I imagine there are people who would be willing to try. But here's what I find really funny about this whole situation." He paused for dramatic effect, clearly relishing the moment. "What's that, sir?" Mary asked, genuinely curious about where this was heading. Prince Philip's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Well, Mrs. Barry, I was just thinking that between the two of us, we probably represent about 150 years of combined experience in dealing with the British public's expectations about food. You've spent decades teaching people how to cook properly, while I've spent decades eating what people cook for me and try to look grateful regardless of the results." Mary burst out laughing at this unexpectedly honest assessment. And yet, Prince Philip continued, clearly pleased with Mary's reaction. "Here we are having our most animated conversation about vegetables most people use to bulk up stews, while completely ignoring all these prize-winning roses that we're supposedly here to admire. I suspect we're failing rather spectacularly at being the sort of cultural icons people expect us to be." "Oh, I think you're being rather hard on us," Mary replied, still laughing. "After all, roses are lovely, but you can't make a proper roast dinner with them." "Excellent point," Prince Philip agreed. "Though I have to say, after some of the state dinners I've attended over the years, there have been occasions when I wondered if the chef might have been tempted to try." It was at this moment, as both were laughing together over Prince Philip's irreverent observations about their public personas and the expectations placed upon them, that the moment occurred that would be remembered and retold for years to come. A gentle breeze chose that exact moment to sweep across the garden display, and with perfect timing, it caught the wide brim of Mary's hat. The hat, which had been perfectly positioned throughout the morning and had behaved impeccably during her BBC interview, suddenly decided to take flight. The hat sailed gracefully through the air, executed what could only be described as a perfect pirouette, and landed directly in the middle of a display of prize-winning delphiniums, where it settled among the blue spikes like an unexpected fashion accessory. For a moment, everyone froze. Mary looked mortified, Prince Philip looked surprised, and the small crowd of onlookers held their breath, unsure how this breach of dignity should be handled in the presence of royalty. Then, Prince Philip began to chuckle. "Well," he said, looking from Mary to the hat, and back again, "I have to say that's the most decisive opinion about flower arrangements I've seen all morning. Your hat clearly has strong feelings about delphiniums." Mary Berry's initial mortification at her wayward hat quickly dissolved as Prince Philip's chuckling became more pronounced. The infectious nature of his laughter, combined with the absurdity of the situation, began to affect everyone present. What had started as a potentially embarrassing breach of protocol was transforming into something much more delightful. "Your Royal Highness," Mary said, attempting to maintain some semblance of dignity while clearly fighting her own urge to laugh. "I do apologize. Perhaps I should have chosen a hat with less aerodynamic properties." "Nonsense," Prince Philip replied, his eyes absolutely dancing with mirth. "That was the most entertaining thing that's happened at Chelsea in years. Though I have to say, your hat seems to have impeccable timing. It's managed to position itself exactly where it can get the best view of the prize winners." The hat did indeed look rather settled among the tall blue spires of the delphiniums, as if it had always belonged there. The navy blue of Mary's hat complemented the flowers beautifully, creating an unintentionally artistic tableau that several photographers were now discreetly capturing. "I suppose I should retrieve it," Mary said, looking at the display and trying to calculate the best way to extract her hat without damaging the carefully arranged flowers. "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that just yet," Prince Philip said with a wave of his hand. "Let's see how long it takes someone in authority to notice that we've accidentally redecorated their prize-winning display." As if summoned by his words, a nervous-looking show official approached, clearly torn between the desire to restore order to the flower display and the delicate matter of suggesting that royalty and a beloved television personality should perhaps address the hat situation. "Your Royal Highness, Mrs. Berry," the official said with careful politeness, "would you like me to arrange for someone to—" He gestured vaguely toward the hat. "What do you think, Mrs. Berry?" Prince Philip asked, turning to Mary with exaggerated seriousness. "Should we mount a rescue mission? Or do you think your hat might be enjoying its new position as a garden ornament?" Mary considered the question with equal gravity. "Well, it does seem quite comfortable there. And I have to admit, it's probably the most attention that particular hat has received in years. Perhaps it's found its true calling." "Excellent point," Prince Philip agreed. "Though I suspect it might get rather soggy if it rains later. Hats generally aren't designed for outdoor living, are they?" "No, they're rather more suited to indoor work," Mary conceded. "And I have other engagements today where being hatless might be noticed." "True," Prince Philip mused thoughtfully. "Can't have Britain's favorite baker appearing disheveled at official functions. Bad for the national image." The show official was beginning to look increasingly confused by this extended discussion about whether or not to retrieve a hat from a flower display. But both Prince Philip and Mary seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the absurdity of treating the situation as if it required serious deliberation. Right then, Prince Philip announced suddenly, as if he had just made an executive decision about a matter of state, "I think a rescue mission is definitely called for. Though I have to say, this is probably the first time in my naval career that I've been called upon to extract millinery from hostile flower territory." "Naval career?" Mary asked, momentarily confused by the military reference. "Oh yes," Prince Philip replied with mock seriousness. "This clearly calls for strategic planning and careful execution. Can't just charge in without proper reconnaissance. These delphiniums look quite formidable, and we don't want any casualties." Mary was now laughing openly at Prince Philip's elaborate treatment of the hat rescue as a military operation. "Should I be providing tactical support from a safe distance?" "Absolutely," Prince Philip confirmed. Someone needs to coordinate communications and ensure our escape route remains clear. With great ceremony, Prince Philip approached the delphinium display. The flowers were indeed quite tall and densely planted, and the hat had settled quite thoroughly among them. However, with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades navigating formal occasions without causing accidents, he managed to extract Mary's hat without disturbing a single flower. Mission accomplished, he announced triumphantly, presenting the hat to Mary with a slight bow. One navy hat, rescued from enemy territory with minimal collateral damage. My hero, Mary replied with a theatrical curtsy as she accepted her hat. I shall have to remember to pack emergency hat retrieval equipment for future garden visits. Sound thinking, Prince Philip agreed. Though I have to say, this has been far more entertaining than most hat-related incidents I've encountered over the years. As Mary settled her hat back on her head, adjusting it carefully to ensure it was properly secured, Prince Philip continued with obvious enjoyment. You know, Mrs. Barry, in all my years of attending official functions, I've seen quite a few hat catastrophes. Ladies' hats seem to have minds of their own when it comes to wind and formal occasions. Oh dear, Mary said. I hope I'm not joining a rather unfortunate tradition. Not at all, Prince Philip assured her. Most hat incidents are much less graceful than yours. I once watched a rather elaborate feathered creation take flight during a garden party at Buckingham Palace and land directly in the fish pond. The owner was so mortified that she pretended not to notice and spent the rest of the afternoon chatting pleasantly while her hat floated past the windows behind her. She didn't try to retrieve it? Mary asked, fascinated by this glimpse into royal garden party mishaps. Oh, absolutely not, Prince Philip replied with evident amusement. Much too dignified for that, though I did notice that the palace staff had to fish it out later with a net, and it had apparently startled several of the ornamental carp quite considerably. I can imagine, Mary said, picturing the scene. Fish probably aren't used to encountering millinery in their natural habitat. Exactly, Prince Philip agreed. Though I have to say, your delphinium landing was much more aesthetically pleasing. At least the colors coordinated. By this point, their extended hat rescue operation and subsequent discussion had attracted a considerably larger audience. Word had spread throughout the press day attendees that Prince Philip and Mary Barry were having what appeared to be the most enjoyable conversation of the morning, complete with impromptu hat retrieval comedy. The BBC crew had managed to position themselves to capture some of the interaction, though they had been careful to maintain the respectful distance that such occasions required. However, it was clear that this spontaneous moment was exactly the sort of content that would resonate with viewers who were always eager to see the more human side of both royal family members and beloved television personalities. You know, Prince Philip said, looking around at their audience with a slightly mischievous expression, I think we may have inadvertently provided more entertainment than some of the official displays. Should we take a bow? Mary asked playfully. I think we should probably move along before we completely upstage the flowers, Prince Philip replied. Though I have to say, this has been one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had at Chelsea in years. For me as well, Mary agreed warmly. Who would have thought that courgette cultivation and hat retrieval could make for such a delightful morning? As they began to walk toward the next section of gardens, Prince Philip paused and looked back at the delphinium display that had so recently housed Mary's hat. Mrs. Barry, he said thoughtfully, I've just had rather a wicked thought. Oh, Mary replied, curious about what new observation was coming. Well, Prince Philip continued with obvious delight. I was just thinking that we should probably warn the garden designers that their prize-winning display has now been personally tested for its ability to serve as emergency hat storage. Might want to add that to the judging criteria for future years. Prince Philip's suggestion about adding hat storage capabilities to the garden judging criteria sent Mary into fresh peals of laughter, and their amusement proved to be contagious. Several nearby visitors began smiling and chuckling along, even though they could only catch fragments of the conversation. There is something infectious about seeing two such distinguished figures clearly enjoying themselves so thoroughly. I can just picture the judging forums, Mary said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. Points for color coordination, plant health, design innovation, and millinery accommodation. Exactly, Prince Philip agreed, clearly delighted with how this theme was developing. Though we might need to establish different categories. Some displays would obviously be better suited for summer hats, while others might be more appropriate for winter headwear. This delphinium display would definitely score highly in the Navy hat division, Mary observed, glancing back at the scene of her hat's brief adventure. Oh, absolutely first-rate for Navy, Prince Philip confirmed with mock seriousness. Though I suspect it might clash terribly with anything in bright yellow or pink. Their extended bout of silliness was beginning to draw the attention of the show organizers. Not because anyone disapproved, but because Prince Philip's obvious enjoyment was creating a small traffic jam as other visitors slowed to see what was causing such merriment. The Duke's reputation for pointed observations and occasionally sharp wit was well known, but it was rarer to see him in such genuinely playful spirits. Mary's assistant approached discreetly and caught her eye, pointing to her watch with an apologetic expression. Mary glanced at her schedule and realized with surprise how much time had passed since her BBC interview. What had begun as a brief encounter with Prince Philip had evolved into nearly an hour of the most delightful conversation she'd had in months. "Your Royal Highness," she said reluctantly, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to continue with my scheduled visits. I have several more interviews and garden tours planned." "Of course," Prince Philip replied, though he seemed equally reluctant to end their conversation. "I suppose I should return to my own itinerary as well. Though I have to say, this has been far more entertaining than most of my official engagements." "It's been absolutely lovely," Mary agreed warmly. "I had no idea you were such an expert gardener. I'll never look at heritage tomatoes the same way again." "Likewise," Prince Philip said with a smile. "And I'll certainly think of this morning every time I encounter a problematic courgette surplus." As they prepared to part ways, Prince Philip seemed to consider something for a moment, then made one of the spontaneous decisions that had characterized his entire conversation with Mary. "Mrs. Barry," he said thoughtfully, "I hope you won't think this presumptuous, but if you're ever in the area of Sandringham during growing season, you'd be most welcome to see our vegetable gardens. I think you'd find our heritage variety trials quite interesting, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on our composting system." Mary was clearly touched by this unexpected invitation. Receiving a personal invitation to visit royal gardens was not something that happened often, and the genuine enthusiasm in Prince Philip's voice made it clear that this wasn't just polite protocol. "That would be absolutely wonderful," she replied sincerely. "I'd be honored to see the gardens, and I'd love to learn more about your sustainable growing practices." "Excellent," Prince Philip said, looking pleased. "I'll have someone contact you about arranging a visit. Though I should probably warn you that our head gardener takes vegetable growing very seriously indeed. He might talk your ear off about soil pH levels and crop rotation." "That sounds like exactly my sort of conversation," Mary laughed. "I look forward to it immensely." As they shook hands in farewell, both realized that what had begun as a chance encounter had developed into something quite special. In an age when public figures often had to be careful about every word and gesture, they had found themselves in a wonderfully natural conversation that reminded them both why they had fallen in love with gardening in the first place. "Give my regards to your courgettes," Prince Philip said with a final grin as they parted. "And mine to your beetroot," Mary replied, still smiling broadly. As Mary walked away toward her next appointment, she found herself replaying the morning's conversation in her mind. She had expected her Chelsea Flower Show visit to be pleasant and professionally useful, but she certainly hadn't anticipated having such a delightful time discussing vegetable growing with the Duke of Edinburgh. The combination of his genuine expertise, quick wit, and willingness to be silly about hat-related emergencies had made for one of the most enjoyable encounters she'd had in years. Meanwhile, Prince Philip continued his own tour of the gardens, but his staff noticed that he seemed more animated and energetic than he had at the beginning of the morning. His conversation with Mary Barry had clearly invigorated him, and he approached the remaining garden displays with renewed enthusiasm. "Interesting woman," "That Mary Berry," he commented to his equerry as they walked toward the next scheduled stop, "knows what she's talking about when it comes to vegetables. And she's not afraid to laugh at herself." Refreshing change from some of the people one meets at these functions. "Indeed, sir," his equerry agreed, making a mental note to follow up on the Sandringham garden visit invitation. Word of their extended conversation and the hat incident began to spread throughout the press day attendees. The combination of Prince Philip's obvious enjoyment and Mary Berry's warm personality had created exactly the sort of spontaneous moment that made the Chelsea Flower Show special. While the formal garden displays were certainly impressive, it was often these unplanned human interactions that people remembered most vividly. The BBC crew that had captured some of their conversation was already anticipating how well this segment would be received by viewers. The image of Prince Philip gallantly rescuing Mary's hat from the delphiniums, followed by their extended discussion about the potential for using flower displays as emergency millinery storage, was exactly the sort of content that reminded people why they loved both of these public figures. By the end of the day, their encounter had become one of the talking points among the garden show community. Social media posts began appearing with photos of the hat rescue moment, accompanied by captions celebrating the unexpected friendship between Britain's most senior royal and its most beloved baker. Years later, both Prince Philip and Mary Berry would continue to mention their Chelsea Flower Show conversation in interviews and public appearances. For Prince Philip, it represented the sort of genuine, unguarded interaction that had become rarer as he aged, but which he treasured when it occurred. For Mary, it was a reminder that even the most formal public figures could be wonderfully human when the right circumstances arose. The story of their morning together became part of Chelsea Flower Show folklore, retold by garden enthusiasts and royal watchers alike. It served as a perfect example of how shared interests could bridge any social divide, and how humor and genuine warmth could transform a chance meeting into a memorable friendship. Most importantly, their encounter reminded everyone who heard about it that some of the best conversations in life happen when you least expect them, over subjects as simple as growing your own vegetables and the unpredictable behavior of garden show hats in springtime breezes. In a world often dominated by formal protocol and carefully managed public appearances, Prince Philip and Mary Berry had created a moment of pure, unscripted joy that continued to bring smiles to faces long after the last flower had wilted and the show had ended. The legacy of their conversation lived on not just in the photographs and video footage, but in the reminder that genuine human connection could flourish in the most unlikely circumstances, proving that sometimes the most memorable royal encounters happen not in throne rooms or state dining halls, but among the prize-winning vegetables at Britain's most prestigious garden show.